Today, we're tackling a number that should make every executive sit up. MIT estimate that 95% of all AI projects fail. 95%. So the question is simple. Why are so many organizations getting this wrong? And what separates the 5% that actually create value? Today, I'm joined by Andy Haler, President and CEO, Software Industry Authority, MDM Pioneer, and Global Data Strategist to answer this question. Andy works at the sharp end of data strategy and AI delivery, helping organizations move from ambition to implementation. His work sits at the intersection of data governance, architecture, and business value. In other words, where AI either delivers or disappoints. Andy and I are going to unpack where AI projects derail, whether your AI is a square peg in a round hole, and what the 5% do differently. So if you're serious about going beyond experimentation into measurable results, this episode is for you. Let's get going. Andy, excellent to see you, sir.
Thank you very much for having me on, Kieran.
Andy, MIT say that 95% of all AI projects fail. From your experience, why do so many organizations get this so badly wrong?
Yeah, and in fact, it's not just MIT, by the way. So Boston Consulting Group ran a study in December 2025, came to exactly the same conclusion, 95% failure rate. And there are other figures slightly lower from other organizations, 87%, 85%. But, 95% is, even 85% is obviously not great. I think there's a number of things. The study itself, asked the executives, why they think they'd failed, and that's obviously a good start. There are a number of areas that sort of came up, and I think one of them, which is a common thread, is limited or poor data quality within companies. Clearly, an LLM itself is highly dependent on its training data, but when you do a corporate project, you usually supplement the core training data of the LLM with corporate data, usually through a technique like retrieval augmented generation or RAG. And then what you're doing is you're adding in corporate documents like policy documents, technical documentation, product specifications, training manuals, whatever, into the into the mix, so the LLM can consider those in its answer. Now, that obviously raises the question that if you're plugging in all this corporate data, and if that corporate data is kind of a mess, you're going to potentially have an issue. So that's one kind of reason, I think, why there's a problem. And obviously what that suggests is that companies need to pay a lot of attention to data quality, which has never been a particularly fashionable area. But suddenly it's becoming a lot more important, because it's really one of the key things where your AI project is going to either founder or prosper. I think the second reason is that I think a lot of people haven't really internalized exactly how LLMs work. And what I mean by that is we are so used to dealing with computer systems which are deterministic in nature. So in other words, if you go into Excel and you type in two figures and you put a third cell and you say multiply those two cells together, you get an answer. And you get an answer tomorrow that's the same, and the day after, and the day after that, and the day after that. And that is not how LLMs work. LLMs are probability generating engines that predict one token at a time, and token is like a small word, but essentially is the unit of LLMs, and they predict what they think is the most plausible next token, or next word, or whatever in an answer. And so, if you ask an LLM a question, something very factual like, what's the capital of France? It's got millions and millions of examples in its training data that tell you that the capital of France is Paris. So it is extremely high chance that it will come back to you and say it's Paris. And if you ask it again, it will say Paris, and you ask it again, it will say Paris, and you ask it again, it will say Paris. But eventually, it won't. One day, it will say Canberra or Kuala Lumpur, because somewhere in its training data, which includes, reliable sources like Reddit, which is the online forum, which is literally the single most popular source for LLM data, by the way, training data, then eventually someone in there will have made some horrendous, blunder, and it will decide that, well, today's the day I'm going to pick the 730th most likely response. And so one of the key reasons we're saying this is that clearly, because we're used to systems which behave deterministically, people just kind of assume that that's the way it's going to be with LLMs, and they're dead wrong. And so they therefore try to apply a probabilistic solution to something that often requires a deterministic answer. And if they do that, they're going to be disappointed. And there are many examples that I'd be very happy to share. I've come across in my sort of research for the book, which kind of illustrate that. Just a trivial one, there's a lot of legal cases now where the lawyers have used ChatGPT to generate court submissions quoting precedent cases. And it turns out that, of course, LLMs hallucinate at, roughly 1 in 5 of the answers at the time. It varies by the model. It varies, how much training data they've got. But as a ballpark, 1 in 5 is not far off. So typically in these cases, if they submit, say, 20 precedent cases, kind of 4 of them are going to be hallucinated and just made up. And that's started to be noticed by judges. So the last time I looked, there were 230 legal cases in the US that have been referred for penalties for the lawyers involved who submitted things to a judge. And in fact, just literally last night I was talking to a friend who was a judge in the UK, and he said there had been a UK case where the judge himself had submitted a very long judgment, and it turned out to have hallucinated cases. So this is obviously, this is an area where, the propensity of large language models to basically make things up when they don't know the answer, and because they're probability engines, is something which is a problem. And if you're in an area like the law, where people require some level of consistency and certainty, then what it says is this is not a great area to be doing it, or at the very least, what it means is you've got to have some sort of human in the loop. And I think that's the sort of key, recurring theme on many of these things, is that you can't be trusting an LLM to produce the same answer time and again. You need to have humans checking them.
Which is rather going to disappoint a lot of people. And as you say, it's not just law, it's medical science, or I kind of want my aircraft engineers not necessarily prompting how to actually fix something. So is AI a square peg in a round hole then for many companies or projects?
I think one thing's really worth saying, and it doesn't get said enough in the press and media, I think, is that people bandy around the word AI as if there's one kind of AI. They're talking about ChatGPT, when in fact AI is kind of a bunch of things. So, for example, machine learning has been around for quite a long time and doesn't hallucinate in the same kind of way that LLMs do, and is very good at spotting patterns in data. So it's often used for predictive maintenance, for example, on vehicles or in factories. And in fact, some of the use cases of AI which you read about, sort of the ones that are very successful, if you dig into them, it's quite curious how often it turns out to be a machine learning example, not actually an example at all. So machine learning has certainly got its place and can be very, very useful in a whole bunch of cases. To take another type of AI, reinforcement learning, that's the technology that's used by DeepMind, the Google subsidiary, when they were producing initially sort of game playing tools like AlphaZero for chess and AlphaGo for the game of Go, but much more usefully the thing called AlphaFold, which is something that predicts the way that proteins unfold in three-dimensional space. And that sounds very obscure, but is an enormously important area in drug discovery, where people are trying to predict what sort of compounds might be candidates for a new type of drug. And this particular type of learning, which has absolutely nothing to do with LLMs whatsoever, turns out to be extremely effective in certain cases. And this AlphaFold is probably one of the most useful advances that AI has delivered in recent years. So that's the first thing to say, is that there's different kinds of AI. There are even other ones, but I think that just gives you the point. So the first thing is to say, what kind of AI are you talking about? You're talking machine learning, you're talking LLM, you're talking reinforcement learning, you're talking something else. And that's the very first sort of angle to choose, before you sort of get into anything else.
So it could be the wrong AI is the square peg in a round hole.
Yeah,
so if we've talked about some of the things like AI going wrong, making sure that you understand determinism, probability models or probabilistics. What one move, what one mistake do you think pops most projects on a path to failure, but before they even start? What would you really call out? And I'm narrowing you to one because I'm sure there's tons.
I really believe that it's not realizing that LLMs are probabilistic is the single thing that will cause them to be applied to areas which they will fail at, and I think I was a couple of years ago guilty of this myself on a project where I was using it for something which I thought naively it would be good at, around textual analysis, but again I eventually, after more time than I would care to admit, using 4 different AIs, I hit a barrier, and I just think it dawned on me that, hang on a minute, this is never going to work, and I was doing it myself, and so it's very easy to slip into a mode where you're just so used to computers that give you consistent answers, and there are many problems in business where you think, I'd like to analyze a whole pile of data or a whole bunch of documents, and or that that'd be, AI sounds great for that, and then you always got to ask that caveat: and do you want the same answer every time? Do you want the same answer day after day after day? And are you confident that the data is good enough that it's going to have a very low rate of hallucination? Basically AIs hallucinate, which is an anthropomorphic term which not everybody likes, but it's so common I'm going to stick to it. Essentially they hallucinate when they haven't got complete enough training data. So they are, the way that internal training works with LLMs, there are 3 stages of training, which I won't bore you with, but essentially they are rewarded for complete, confident answers. So rather than saying, I have no idea, which is what a human might say, well, that's not the way that the LLM training typically goes. So they are heavily rewarded for providing conclusive answers, and so if they don't have sufficient training data to find those answers, and they don't have enough supplementary data that's maybe been provided to them to answer it, they will come up with something very, very plausible. And in fact, and then just as an anecdote, the very, very first question I ever asked ChatGPT, and it wasn't because I was trying to trip it up, because I barely knew sort of what it was at the time, was I had in front of me a chess tournament schedule. I played some chess, and I happened to have been in sort of 30 years ago, and so I had the results of the tournament in front of me. So I was just curious as to whether an LLM would even know about such a thing, So I asked this question about, tell me about this tournament, and who won it and what it was on. And he came out with an incredibly plausible answer. He said, yes, it was held here and these dates. Here is the winner. Here are all the results. Here's the cross table of results. And for a minute, I was, I was very impressed. I thought, oh wow, this is tremendous. I looked at it more closely. Well, hang on a minute, that isn't quite right. Some of the players are right, but some of them are not. But they weren't bad. They weren't just invented names. They were all players from that era that it somehow come up with, and it filled in the sort of bits it didn't know with extremely plausible answers. So if you didn't really have the exact answer in front of you, this would look like an extremely profound and perfectly put together answer. It just happened to be wrong. And I think that the thing that sort of did teach me was that when you're asking them a question that you don't know the answer to, and you're using it for research, you've got to remember that how sure are you that the answer it's coming back with is correct? Because if you ask it in areas where you do know a lot about, it's again 1 in 5 answers are made up, roughly. So
very confidently correct and very confidently wrong.
Confidently wrong is the key message, and so you've just got to be aware of that when you're thinking about how you apply it into projects, and thinking about review stages, putting in processes where human experts can check it. So if you were that legal firm, producing this thing for the judge, and you decide that you're going to use an LLM to save time, because I'm sure when they do that, I'm sure they bill the clients much less when they use the LLM than they would have done before, because it reflects the massive time savings. Then if they do that, then they do need to factor in a significant time for somebody to go back and cross-check. And in fact, I mean, just the other day, a few weeks ago, Deloitte found this to their cost when they did a project for the government of Australia, and they produced a very lengthy sort of multi-hundred-page strategy document, 440,000 Australian dollars. So, it's quite a lot of money. And anyway, it turned out full of quotes and cases and examples that, when somebody actually knew the area, dug into it, went, hang on a minute, that's not true at all. This doesn't exist at all. But, Deloitte have happily charged the full amount, and they eventually did some kind of partial refund because the thing made it into the national press, But that was just another example where what they should have done is say, okay, fine, well, we're going to use them to help write it, because they write very fluently, maybe they write better than some of their junior consultants, I don't know. But what they should have done is to take some more of those junior consultants to do a very, very detailed line by line fact check and to strip out any errors before it got anywhere near the client. But they didn't. And as I say, because the LLM answers tend to be very confident and they're very fluent writers. I mean, they write very, it's not. It may be it may not be Shakespeare, but it's certainly very, very capable text that's free of typos and so on. It tends to it looks authoritative, and it's very, very, very important to understand that some of those things will not be correct, and you need to be checking absolutely everything, and you need to put a process in place to make sure that happens. And that will cost you sort of more than if you just press a button and it just generated it. But that's there's nothing for free in this world. As some of my favorite movies, The Princess Bride, said that life is pain, and anybody who tells you different is selling something. And in the case of consultants who are selling you $440,000 reports that they produced in 5 minutes, then there isn't such a thing as a free productivity gain. There may well be some productivity gain, but it comes with some additional safeguards and checks that you need to build into the process.
Yeah, I sort of wonder, do we actually have those in the real world? Because you very often critique a machine, and then when you dig underneath, and this is one of the challenges I see in the world, trying to get AI in, the standard operating procedure isn't so standard. The data isn't so good. We haven't trained our people. And let's be honest, 99.9999999% of the population are not Shakespeare. And therefore, every little bit of advantage they can get is useful. So, Andy, what do the top 5% do differently then?
Well, I think firstly, being very, very aware of what the things can and can't do. I think the second thing is that they apply the right AI to the right problem. So in the case of someone who wants to look at, say, factory production lines, sort of the sensor data to sort of spot problems with predictive maintenance, they understand enough that they're going to use machine learning for that. They're not going to try to throw an LLM at it. So understanding, what kind of AI there is, and sometimes whether AI is just not appropriate at all for the solution, that's also very possible. So that's, I think, one of the first things is they get that right. I think the second thing is that they put a lot of effort into reviewing their data quality. So they'll typically have strong sort of data governance. There'll be extensive use of data quality technologies, some of which uses AI in itself to generate business, sort of data quality rules and business rules, for example. So if you've got something where you're using the right tool on a very good set of data for a task that's appropriate, then it's going to hopefully work quite well. And unfortunately, at the moment, that's showing up at about 5% of the cases. There was a report just literally yesterday in the Wall Street Journal that was quoting the chief economist of Goldman Sachs, and they asked what's been the productivity effect of AI on the US economy, and he said, well, as far as we can tell, it's zero.
Oh wow! Wow!
It's
but again, just go back
near zero, I think was the precise phrase.
Just think what the productivity of the average worker is. I say that gently. And I wonder, like, we do look at AI and we say it's 95% correct. I made a comment the other week to someone who was quoting me the same figure. I said, well, if you can find me an employee who's 95% correct, give them to me. I'll train them. If they're going to get it right 95% of the time, they're much better than most of the population.
Yeah, well, 95% would be good. But what we're saying is it's 5%. Not
that's whoops.
That's the point. Yeah,
so a lot of people think that Andy,
someone is at least 5%.
Well, I want slightly higher than 5% paying someone's wage. But so if a lot of people currently today think that it's the model of success, because you see lots of pick OpenAI, pick Claude, pick Grok, and everything's focused in that conversation. But in reality, then, from what you're describing, how important is data quality? How important is processes? How important is our people?
Well, data quality, as I say, comes up as the number one quoted reason for AI project failure by the practitioners. And that's been in study after study. It was mentioned in the MIT study, but as I said, there have been at least 4 or 5 different ones. And data quality always seems to be the highest one. So having robust data quality processes in place, and what we mean by that is having strong data governance, data ownership, so people actually, business people owning the quality of the data, not deferring it to the IT department, but actually taking ownership of it, having processes in place that measure data quality, using technology to help with that. And so data quality industry itself has taken advantage actually of AI, not necessarily LLMs, but mostly machine learning, in order to scale up to higher levels. Because in the past, if you go back 5 years, people would typically invent data quality rules by hand. They would put them into either some sort of catalog or some sort of data quality tool individually. So they say, okay, this value here has to be, this field here has to be within a certain range, or this thing here has to be an integer, or this thing here has to be delivered within 30 days, or whatever the rule is, and that was all done by hand. Now, what a lot of tools these days can do is to generate at least suggestions for these rules by actually observing the data. So machine learning algorithms will observe, months and months or years and years of data and spot patterns in that data, and they can therefore detect which things are anomalous. So, for example, and you've got to be very careful here, because you might take something where you get a typical order value, and you say, well, okay, something that's very low or very high, you need to, make an alert for that to suggest that's a candidate error. But if you're, say, a seasonal business, the ice cream business or the pumpkin business in November or October rather, then you obviously there will be seasonal spikes. But I mean, machine learning algorithms are clever enough that they will be able to spot those kinds of things as normal. And they won't issue sort of false positive alerts, at least not anywhere near as many as used to happen when humans were doing it. So you can use these modern data quality tools, and there are a bunch of them now, to help you really sort of both implement data quality, but also to do it at scale in a way that was quite expensive and difficult before. So I think having these robust tools in place is important. And I think with people, I think having a much higher degree of AI literacy in terms of training programs is really, really important. As I've mentioned before, I think most people are not that familiar with the sort of the idiosyncrasies, if you like, of LLMs. I met someone I won't name, but recently who was actually a consultant for a well-known management consultants firm, who allegedly worked in AI and didn't know what an hallucination was. I was absolutely gobsmacked. I couldn't believe it. I had to explain it a couple of times. I thought I must have been, saying the wrong word or something. She literally.
Were you hallucinating?
had no idea. You can't be. They don't do that. You surely not. And this is someone advising companies on AI strategy. So never mind people in just regular jobs who that's not their job to understand the internals of AI. But if you but I think if you put enough at least some level of training in place, then you can start to help people spot the kind of the pros and the cons, the idiosyncrasies, and make fewer errors basically when they're using LLMs and other AI techniques. and just rolling that kind of literacy program out, I think in itself would save an enormous amount of trouble, and probably significantly reduce this kind of currently really quite ridiculously high failure rate that we're seeing in the industry at the moment.
Yeah, I think I was slightly disappointed when I heard the EU Act watered down the necessity to have AI education, in position. I could be wrong, but I hope to goodness I hallucinated when I read that, but I might not have been. So what companies would you recommend, or what steps would you recommend, Andy, companies take to get AI to be successful? And I suppose define what you mean by success as well.
Well, I think for a start, I grew up in two very large companies, Exxon and Shell. They had very robust sort of project evaluation processes. So absolutely everything in the case of Exxon, more than $50,000, had to go through a cost-benefit analysis that produced a net present value, an IRR, payback period, and this is how I was trained. So absolutely any IT investment or any investment in oil rig or whatever had to have a robust, return on investment analysis. And the AI investment should be just the same as like any other investment. So the first thing I think is to step back and say, what's the return on investment analysis? If you're going to apply AI in these various areas, you've got maybe a whole bunch of different candidate projects you could use things for. Some things are probably going to be easier than others. Some things are going to have a higher return than others, even though they may be more difficult perhaps. But in putting a robust return on investment methodology in place will start to help you prioritize which projects are going to give you the best bang for the buck. So I think that's shouldn't really have to be said. But I mean, having worked as later when I set up a software vendor, working with other companies, I realized that almost nobody did this. I mean, I was absolutely flabbergasted when I started working with companies that weren't Exxon and Shell. That this was not completely the norm everywhere. And I was having to explain ROI and IRR and MPV, and it was like a speaking different language. But I mean, so that's one thing I think, putting a robust, investment case forward. Next thing would be, as say, to put in place, good data literacy, AI literacy programs, as we've discussed. I think this is it is very, very important, because people are going to come across all kinds of issues, and the more education they've got about at least the basics of how these technologies work, the better chance they've got of navigating. And as I say, again, listening to the projects, these large studies that have been done on AI projects, really re-examining the whole area of data quality, data governance, to really make sure that you've got a solid data governance program. I mean, it's quite disturbing in a way that I've been working in data quality and master data management for many, many years, that every single year there's a survey done by one or other of the big sort of firms, whether it's Deloitte or KPMG or Accenture or whatever, and they will ask a couple of thousand executives, how much do you trust the quality of data in your organization? And to be honest, the figures never budged. It's always around 30 to 35% of executives trust the data in their organization. It's never 20, it's never 40. It's always in the range 30 to 35, and it's been like that for decades, to be honest with you. And that suggests that we're not doing this really well, because if you're saying that AI projects depend on high quality data, and yet only 1/3 of executives trust their own data currently, you suggest that if you're going to put some effort into doing something, fixing the data quality might be a really good place to start. Because this will have an impact, and it will have an impact outside of the AI projects as well. I mean, having better quality data will help you avoid a whole bunch of problems, and usually can be, fairly easily cost justified. It's just been one of those Cinderella subjects that's not been really given any, very high level of attention. I mean, nobody ever wanted to be promoted to be data quality manager. It just doesn't happen, right? You always wanted to be, something, but that was never the trendiest or most glamorous of areas. But in the world of AI, where AI is utterly dependent on the data that they see, and data quality suddenly should be much higher on that agenda and should be much more, prioritized.
Yeah, I haven't seen, as you say, too many executives standing in front of the mirror going, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's got the dirtiest data of them all. But important. What other final advices would you give to companies who are thinking about AI, failing to scale, really want and definitely do need to get AI working, but just aren't quite at the races yet?
I think there's some general advice which you probably give to any new technology, which is you can think about setting up some kind of internal sort of center of excellence where you take a bunch of people who are dedicated to the job, who get a very high level of training and can start to test things out and evaluate tools and to use them in anger, and then train those people up so that they can advise other projects, and a sort of support basis. And that's something which is true of, this would also be true if you were doing all kinds of other different projects, by the way. But it's generally true. And again, very generic advice, which has always served me so well in my career, is that you don't try not to boil the ocean, as the saying goes. The people often have these incredibly grandiose plans for whatever the latest technology is, and that's fine. But you need to sort of think big but start small, and pick off the low-hanging fruit projects where you are going to get some success. And that comes back to this whole return on investment methodology, where if you can see and actually analyze the likely financial impact that a project is going to have, and you find is there will be some things which have a high financial impact and actually aren't that hard. Other things are going to have a low financial impact and are really hard, and other things that are in the middle. And so it makes sense to begin with taking it easy and trying to do the things that have some impact fairly quickly, and you learn on those projects and you deliver success. You deliver something that's practical, and then people say, oh wow, that project over there, that did really well, maybe we'll have some of that. And because in general, I think, having worked for two huge organizations plus my own software company, I would say that most in very large organizations, people are typically somewhat reluctant to deal with change. They don't necessarily like to change their existing processes and are often quite resistant to change. But what they will see, if they see some colleague in another area, another department or another line of business, getting a success with something, they will willingly follow it rather than resisting. So I think, again, this approach of doing sort of small, manageable projects which can deliver, not necessarily huge, but quick return, and making successes of those, publicizing those successes, communicating those successes to colleagues, then you'll start to build up a sort of momentum behind this. And I think I'd say this is advice that it would be true of almost any new technology. It's not really specific to AI, but it again, it tends to be sort of old but sage advice, really.
Yeah, the basics never change, have they, despite the tech? And I would +1 everything you've said there. And again, small additions, which is make sure that the project's actually pointed at the North Star, i.e. the business goals. It's helping fulfill the business vision, not just AI theatre to be ticking a box to say you've done AI, of course. And all those small things build up to big things. They all compound. But not only that, as you say, Andy, it builds confidence, it builds capability, it gets you the win, it frees you some time, it gets you some cash, keeps people confident, and then you can go on to the next and the next and the next. Andy, very quickly before we close, you have a book out though, and we're talking about education. Show us the book and tell me a little bit about it.
I happen to have a
learn if they read
so,
it. It's an excellent book, by the way. I've read it cover to cover. Yes, I mean, what I try to do in this book is to help educate people about not the really technical internals of gradient descent or anything, but talking about how LLMs work in a sort of at a practical level, talking about this really coming back to this thing about probabilistic versus deterministic, sort of nailing that sort of down, and then talking about how AI can be applied in different industries. So talking about the different types of AI, talking about how that's work, seeing real examples from industry after industry after industry. And then the book also covers some more general issues around sort of AI legislation. You mentioned the EU Act, for example. There are others around the world, and other general issues around sort of AI ethics. And then talking a little bit about the future of AI, or possible futures of AI. And so it's intended for really anybody who's really wants to understand AI better, either in
at work or in their own personal life, and who wants to be more successful with it, basically. And I think there's something in that book for most people, and it's written for a general audience rather than a sort of highly technical audience. And I think I hope it's useful to people who buy it. You can order it on Amazon. You can order it. There's some other platforms as well, Barnes and Noble and other online platforms in America, for example. But essentially, the obvious thing is to order it on Amazon. So yeah, it's just called Beyond the Hype: A Realist Guide to AI by Andy Haler. It just published in 2026.
Yeah, and it delivers. It really does. I loved it. I read it end to end, and then I handed it to my son, who's currently reading it, and he's going, first time I've seen a book that gives me proper examples. So there's a testament alone. So look, folks, here's the bottom line. Look, AI doesn't fail because the models are weak. It fails because the foundations are weak. So unclear ownership, poor data, vague success metrics, tech-first thinking, grand projects with no defined return. The 5% do the opposite. They choose the narrow, high-value use cases. They match the right technique and AI to the right problem. They define what success looks like in commercial terms. They assign real business owners. They measure relentlessly. So before your next AI initiative begins, just pause for a second. Audit your use cases. Be honest about your data quality, define the ROI case, align the stakeholders, start small, review constantly. AI is powerful, but only when it's applied with discipline. Andy, thank you so much for the insight and the clarity today. And thank you to everyone for listening. If you want to be on the 5%, focus less on the model and more on the operating model. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much indeed for having me, Kieran.